there's a liberating quality to that, to just not have to worry about anything about yourself and just have your whole purpose be directed to someone else. But it has to come from like a sort of voluntary position when it's done like voluntary and when it's done with like proper compensation. And then I think it can be a quality that we nowadays tend to dismiss too often. Welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast that seeks to explore the depths of what cinema has to offer. My name is Tom, you may know me as the creator of Like Stories of Old, and I'm joined by my fellow video essayist Thomas Flight to talk about Wes Anderson's The Grand Budapest Hotel. Before we begin, if you enjoy our show and want to help us keep it going, you can support us in two ways. The first is to listen to Cinema of Meaning on Nebula, which lets you enjoy each episode completely ad-free and a week early. The second way is to join our Discord community on Patreon, where you can discuss movies with us and with fellow listeners. Both Nebula and Patreon will also give you instant access to all of our monthly bonus episodes, which by now has grown into a significant catalog. For more information, check out the description, you'll find everything you need in there. Thank you for listening to Cinema of Meaning. Now on to the show. Thomas, you are a big fan of Wes Anderson.
This is
I think
true.
Probably a lot more than I am.
Yeah, that's probably fair.
I like him too, but there's not a lot of movies that I really have that deep of a connection to. And for some reason, like, his style is kind of like whimsical, which I can admire, but not that deeply connect to always. But at the same time, I do really admire him for really having like a true voice of his own. You see it a lot in people who try to emulate or to imitate him, which always falls a little bit flat, which for me only goes to show that there's more to Wes Anderson than just the visual presentation of his movies that gets talked about most often, which I'm sure we'll also get into with our discussion on Grand Budapest Hotel, which I think is one of his most popular ones, right? At least here it was.
Yeah, I think it's probably his most widely acclaimed. It's the one I see thrown out most frequently as like the best. Although like a lot of people who are into Wes Anderson have their own personal favorites. That might be older ones, but yeah, I think just in terms of broad popularity, it's also, I think it marked kind of a new phase in terms of his style visually, where it felt like when he hit the Grand Budapest Hotel, it felt like this was something that he had kind of almost been building towards throughout his career. So I think that was really interesting to people who liked that, to see kind of this like intensification of everything about his style. And he's kind of only continued along that thread since then. So I think this one also marks just like kind of the height, maybe not the peak, but like a new height in terms of that whimsy and the color palettes and all the things that, people like, the people who like those things like about a Wes Anderson movie usually. But also I think this one, and we'll dive into the nitty gritty, but like I think this one has a really compelling character at its core. Singular character in a way that I don't want to say like the other Wes Anderson films before this didn't have necessarily. Like, I think there's compelling characters throughout, but if you look at something like the Darjeeling Limited, it's more of an ensemble piece. There's no like one central character there. Moonrise Kingdom is these two kids, that it's kind of fun, but again, it's more of this like ensemble cast where you're engaging with this story, but the central character of Gustav H in this, and Ray Fiennes' performance, and just kind of the focus on that character, and then the duo of him and Zero kind of at its core, I think like made this one one that maybe is a little bit more emotionally even underneath all the layers of like aesthetic whimsy that are happening. It is more emotionally accessible. One of the more emotionally accessible movies that he's had in a while leading up to this one, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. I remember my issue with a lot of Anderson's previous movies was usually that I could see that they would have these genuinely great moments, but they were always kind of, for me, a little bit almost obstructed by the style, which would sometimes overwhelm the more genuineness that the movies also contain. Like, still, one of my favorite moments in any movie really is in what's the name right now? The scuba.
Steve Zissou, The Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou.
Yes.
Yeah.
That one, there's that moment where they go down in the submarine and they encounter like this shark, which was like the bane of Bill Murray's existence, and then he just kind of he's on this quest to destroy this creature, and then he sees it, and the only thing that he says is, "Oh, I wonder if it remembers me." And for some reason, that kind of stuck with me ever since. I've only seen the movie once, but for some reason that line always stayed with me. Even though I thought the movie, up until that moment, I was kind of enjoying the movie, but also I wasn't that deeply invested in it until like that moment happened. But yeah, for me, the Grand Budapest Hotel is one that is more consistently filled with that emotional through line that I find really resonating and also very thematically interesting. I think there's some hidden philosophies in there that I'm not sure I've seen a lot of people talk about, but I'm sure we'll get into.
Yeah.
And yeah, as you said, it feels like his style was kind of building up to this, however you would describe this, like this was his ultimate voice or vision, even though he has been expanding on it ever since. I think the French Dispatch feels very similar, but it also innovates in some new little ways, which the Grand Budapest Hotel didn't yet, or which he didn't do for the Grand Budapest Hotel. Even though I enjoyed the French Dispatch a lot less. I'm looking forward to Asteroid City, though. I haven't seen that one yet.
It's getting good buzz though, and I think it looks like it has maybe more of a return to a certain form of story, like the Grand Budapest that we didn't see in the French Dispatch, which I really loved. But I think like if you place his films on kind of this spectrum where you have like these more personal stories, of something like Rushmore, where it's about this character and there's kind of some emotion to engage with there, or just the like opposite end of that spectrum where it's just about sort of dissecting and appreciating it aesthetically, or like it's very dense and it's about all these little clever in jokes and literary devices and all of this kind of stuff. It's like the French Dispatch was the peak of that. I mean, it's 3-4 different stories, so there's no like real like story to sink your hands into in the same way that there is in some of the others. So I think like I understand, like I like that one because I like all those little things about his movies, but I completely understand why there's a lot of people who don't, because it's just like, if you want like an actual story with a character that's like doing on a journey, or like going on an arc or something, you kind of get those within each micro story, but it's not the same. So
yeah.
But that said, I think Asteroid City looks more like maybe a return to that. We'll see, but yeah, I think it's interesting to see, not to get too sidetracked into all his other movies, but I think it's interesting to see, since the Grand Budapest Hotel, I think he's become more almost surreal as a filmmaker. So yeah, I'm fascinated to see how things continue to develop from here. because like I said, this one felt like he hit a new height, and I think nobody was like, where do you go beyond this one? But he's continuing to find ways to to like do his thing in a new and unique
to
way.
ramp it up even further. Yeah.
So
I have one general question to
Sure.
a true like Wes Anderson fan. Like, what do you think his style? What purpose does it serve ultimately? Or like, why do you think he makes movies in the way that he does? Because he uses the same style to touch on various different stories and very different genres almost.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm curious what you think why does he tell stories this way?
Right. My take on it, and maybe this sounds a little bit like a cop out, but this is my honest belief, and I kind of unravel this there's a big long Wes Anderson video I made called Why Are Wes Anderson Movies Like That? And my take on it is that I think he genuinely loves the act of storytelling and sees like how you tell a story and all of the little tiny ways in which you can embellish a story as interesting and as fun and as sort of like valid as pursuits in and of themselves as the actual content of the story. I think that's just like a certain approach that some people are going to really appreciate, and some people find that to be like a barrier to actually connecting with the story. But it's a very I hate to throw this term out there because it maybe sounds a little pretentious, but it strikes me as a kind of like literary approach in some ways, where there's certain books I read where it's like there's certain writers where it's not so much about the story you're getting across. We talked about Haruki Murakami a while ago, I think when we did Burning, and also we've talked about Drive My Car. But he's one of those authors where what is even happening in those books? It's like hard to tell, but you're in this like mood and atmosphere, and it's about how the story is being told. And Wes Anderson isn't the only person who does this in film. There are lots of other, like David Lynch is another example where it's like it's much more about the atmosphere of his films, the mood, what you're feeling, than it is about the plot that's happening on screen. But I think the way Wes Anderson is doing that is unique from how anyone else is doing it, where it has it has like a storybook quality to it, that I really think nobody else is touching on. So I don't know. I don't know if that answers the question, but I do think it's genuinely
I'll take that answer,
I've read all the like Matt Zoller Seitz interviews, and he doesn't do a lot of press, but like the impression I get from everything that he says about his work is that he does it this way really because that's the way he wants to do it. He likes it, and there's not a whole lot. There's not like a whole lot more to it than that, which maybe isn't like the deepest like approach, but I think there's something about that genuinely resonates with me because it's fun, and there's just sort of like a kind of a carefree nature to that. Although that stands in
playfulness.
Yes, yeah. But that stands in stark contrast to the also the rigidity of it and the sort of meticulous control and the deep melancholy that I think is there, especially in this movie, but in a lot of his movies as well.
It's kind of like Kubrick, but for sad children.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I don't know. Maybe one thing I think that might bridge us into this actual movie was, I was thinking this time watching it, I've seen this a bunch of times. This was probably my 5th time or something like that. But one thing I was thinking about watching this was how much this is a story about somebody who's kind of like entering into trying to hold on to this thing, or trying to participate in a culture and a society that they're not really a part of. There's that line towards the end where the older Zero, played by Murray F. Abraham, says like about Gustav H. says, oh, what? How does that line go? He says something like,
about Gustav, or
yeah, he says it about Gustav. He's like,
I have one quote written down that I really liked, where it says, like, to be frank, I think his world had vanished long before he ever entered it. But I will say he certainly sustained the illusion with a marvelous grace.
Right.
That
right.
one?
Yeah. That's the one. I was thinking about that and that aspect of the character. And I'm not saying that was written to be specifically about Wes, but I was thinking about this character and how it relates to Wes Anderson as a creator of this film, and him being like a guy from Texas who grew up in the middle of Texas. Like this world that he's depicting in this film is like the furthest thing you could imagine from like the middle of Houston, I think is where he's from, or was from originally. And he happened to make a short film with Owen Wilson that did really well at Sundance, and then he got paid to make Bottle Rocket, and then he just kept making movies, and now he lives in Paris. He travels all over, he makes these crazy movies, he goes to Cannes Film Festival, but like he himself as a filmmaker is a guy who was just this guy in Paris, and then who was obsessed with like Jacques Cousteau books and the New Yorker magazine. Like he obviously had this passion for this like culture that doesn't exist in Paris, and he has gone on to make these movies that really like aesthetically like taking on as much of that culture as possible and like really steeped in it. They're very like, Europe is a very central figure in like this movie and a lot of others, and he's adopting all these other cultures into it and trying to really like appreciate them and showcase them. But I do think there's like this sense in the midst of almost his filmmaking of like trying to like attain this thing that was never really his, in a sense, that was never like that he wasn't actually born into, that he was just like trying to participate in. And as he's trying to participate in it, the version of it that maybe he fell in love with or like dreamt of being a part of is kind of, vanishing in a sense. And that's really whether or not my assessment of that being Wes's life and his relationship to this character is correct or not, I think that's very much the like one of the central like elements of this story and one of the interesting parts about it. But anyway, I've talked a lot, so let's I'll calm down, stop ranting about Wes Anderson. We can step back and maybe approach the movie more structured.
Yeah, just to begin at the very beginning, like one of the thing I really noticed this time around is the kind of strangeness of this movie having essentially like 3 separate framing devices.
Yes.
Because it opens on this statue of this writer, and there's some person who's then kind of honoring it, or I don't remember exactly, laying flowers on it or something like that. And then it cuts to that writer when he was still alive, in his old age, narrating about a time when he was younger and going to the Grand Budapest Hotel, where he then met the old Zero, or Mustafa, I think he was then called. And Mustafa then narrates the actual story set in the 1930s with Gustav. So there's like 3 layers of storytelling before we actually get to the real story.
Yeah. So
I'm not sure what the point of that is, just to kind of bury us into the layers of history in a way that it before the story even begins, it already feels distant. You already feel like you've jumped in time backwards like 3 times now, and it does really emphasize that kind of deep sense of history, or that this is some kind of ancient tale from someone who's now long gone and whose story was only survived because he told it to someone else who then wrote it down and is now gone himself. So there's these, I don't know, there's a sense of history, but also the sense that history is kind of fleeting away. And like for every story that we see, like of Gustav, like there's countless more that didn't even survive these 2 generations, or the however long it takes from the first scene, the most present scene, to the oldest one. So that I really liked. I'm guessing also that was my take on it also, but I'm not sure if you have anything to add on that, or.
No, I think that's a great summation of why that. I think like it's to create this sense of, like you said, history, and also like by the time you get to that 3rd layer, like you really do feel like you're being told a story. Like we're removing ourselves from any sense that we're like, what we're seeing is sort of like a depiction of the actual events. It's like it's kind of separating the viewer from that to be like, hey, you're being shown a story. And when that's why when like it cuts to an insert, it's like a little picture object, almost like somebody's holding it up out of the book or something. It's like, I don't know, it's just a story being pieced together with all these artifacts and I don't know. I like that element of it. I think that sets us up for some of the most powerful moments to being in how that story is narrated and framed by the older Zero, and we'll get to some of that down the line, I think.
Yeah, I also find it interesting how each layer shifts the perspective, because in the oldest story, it's really Gustav's, that was his name, right? Gustav's story. Ray Fiennes' character.
Right.
Which then becomes the memory of Zero or Mustafa. But then it becomes a book written by this author, and then the statue at the very beginning is
of the author.
It's in honor of the author, not of the original characters. At the same time, there's a sense of history, but also a sense of being forgotten by history, even as your story sort of echoes through those different stages. Which I don't know. I guess it kind of touches on that melancholy that you talked about earlier, which tends to be present in a lot of Anderson's movies. That whenever people talk about stories or storytelling, there's that inherent sense of inevitably someone will be the last to tell your story, or your story will just fade away entirely. And I don't know, it's just a very nice premise, also reflected, I guess, by the state of the hotel itself, which by the time we're first shown it in the first flashback, 1985, I think it was, it's kind of like dilapidated. It's almost like a ruin of its former glory. And then it's only when we get like way deep into it, like deep into the layers of time, like the 1930-ish story, that we see it in its full glory. And even then, I think it was, I'm not sure if that was the absolute like heyday of that hotel, because it was already on the precipice on like the Second World War, which turned it into a sort of barracks. It's mentioned at some point that it becomes like this Nazi, not necessarily fortress, but just this place where it becomes like a tool of warfare instead of an escape for like people who want to experience a nice vacation, or however Gustav talks about it. He's more poetic about the function that the hotel has. But yeah,
I have a question for you in regards to this. So you mentioned like the Second World War, and it's obviously this very like European. It has but it's a made up country like
Yeah.
Zubrovka, I think is the name of it. There's another one, Lutz, I think is also just like
Something
an
like that.
invented
Yeah.
country. And like, you know, they are for all intents and purposes Nazis in the movie, but like instead of being the SS, they're the ZZ, the Zigzag Squad or something. It's just like this like child storybook fantasy version of Europe, which like is kind of, I don't know, I don't know exactly what the purpose of that is, except to like place us deeper into like this is just a story kind of thing. But I was curious if like how like that's just like a funny weird thing to me, but I was curious if that like makes any particular impression on you as someone in Europe. Does it feel weirder, or I don't know, I guess you don't know how it feels outside of
No,
that.
I wouldn't say so. I think I experienced it in the same way that you did. But for me, it almost feels like folklore. Like
Right.
it is a story. If I didn't know who the filmmaker was, I would have guessed it was someone who comes from like Austria or some Central European country.
Right.
Who then kind of tells this mythological tale about an era of the Second World War. But yeah, I kind of liked it. It feels, because I do recognize elements, like heightened elements of
Yeah.
how Europe can sometimes feel, even to this day. Like if you go to like Switzerland or Australia or some of the, especially the more Eastern European countries, which this movie seems to be, or where this fictional country is supposed to be positioned somewhere. Maybe it's like there's like a small state. It's called Liechtenstein. Maybe it's something like that. But anyways, it feels like it's positioned somewhere in there. And if you go there now, it does feel like they're stylistically, some of those tiny old quaint little villages can still invoke that same atmosphere where you can imagine like a story like this once took place, and that it once also then in your sort of nostalgic memory it could look like this. It has this almost fairy tale-ish kind of quality. But yeah, and I always felt like it was a nice representation of like a very romanticized view of Europe, but also one that we ourselves, I think, tend to kind of relish in sometimes, or like kind of it does kind of represent, I think, how Europeans sort of dreamily look back on their own history and their own folklore and stuff.
Yeah. So it's kind of a caricature, but it's not like a bad one.
No, I wouldn't say so. You can always ask the question, like there's also the Jojo Rabbit, for example, these movies that are about these really serious parts of the Second World War, but tend to present them in this kind of satire-ish manner. Like, you can say, like, does that make light of the real events, or does it make it more accessible by having this extra layer of detachment between the seriousness of the material and the presentation of the movie? But I never really had a strong opinion on that, really. I think generally most things are just fair game. Like, if you feel like this is a good way to tell the story, then go for it, I'd say. It didn't like... I don't think I've ever seen a movie that really genuinely offended me in any way by tackling a movie without... Of course, I'm sure there's plenty of movies that tackle serious issues without any grace or consideration, but I think in this case, I can't imagine any European person, I guess, finding offense in the way this movie depicts it, because it's ultimately it takes the setting of the Second World War, but I think the story is ultimately so much more than that, and I feel like maybe that's also why Anderson deliberately wanted some distance between the real history and the kind of story as it's presented here, even though it's obviously set in or grounded in real history. And I'm not sure. I think it could have gotten away with if it just shown like the Nazis as actual Nazis and the flags as accurate, but
Right.
it does allow the movie to transcend history a little bit, to become more of this a sort of timeless myth that you could potentially like revisit
Yeah.
250 years from now when the actual history of war is long forgotten, but like the sort of the symbolical archetypes are the only things that are still that have still survived. And
Yeah. I kind of like it in a sense because it sort of removes like accuracy from the conversation. It's just like, oh, it's not historically accurate because it's not even trying to be like a positioned in history. It's just like it's an impression of a time somewhere that may have happened, and it's a story about that is I don't know, but that doesn't remove any of the legitimacy of sort of what it gets at emotionally in regards to war or sort of the effect surrounding the cultural effect surrounding war is really what this movie feels like it's about in a certain way, which is like I was trying to think of how you would even describe what this movie is. And it's really hard. Even removing all the Wes Anderson bits, it's really hard. It's like it has elements of kind of like a Hitchcockian like political thriller, like, you know, thinking of things like North by Northwest or you know, where there's like kind of not really political scheming, but there's like a conspiracy and a little bit of a mystery, and there's a jailbreak in the middle of it. But there's also this like ambiance of war and the impact of it that's there. It's not really a war movie. But I know, like, I don't know if you've seen Bergman's The Silence, I think it's called. But that's like a film he kind of references in this one in a couple places. And that's also a movie where it's just about like this woman and her son staying in a hotel in Europe, and a war, I forget which one, is happening kind of outside. And we never really see it. There's just like tanks rolling down the streets. But it's kind of about this, like, I've never lived in a place where there's active war happening in my immediate surroundings, but I imagine these movies are about a very particular feeling that arises from being in that kind of scenario of just like, you know, I can imagine to some extent what it must feel like, a sense of displacement or just like things around you having this great sort of instability or just like decaying and falling apart, and people dying and things, you know, sort of like this world that, you know, sort of just disintegrating. So I think it's very much like, I think it's about that, but there's not many movies. I was trying to think of other movies that might be about that specifically, and I couldn't think of many.
I think there's some Italian movies that tend to deal with the war a lot. I once went to this sort of mini film festival where they showed like a lot of old Italian movies that sort of, a lot of which tackled with this concept, you know, the kind of everyday life in a setting of war, or like a story that's not about war but set in the context of one. But I'm having trouble getting remembering.
Well, we don't have to think of. I guess my point there being like, I think this movie is about something very like unique that I'm not saying other films haven't depicted, but what it's getting at as part of its like central thematic exploration is something that, you know, I don't think any movie this big and mainstream has explored that I can think of off the top of my head. Maybe our listeners will think of some and can let us know in our Discord or something. But because I'm sure there's other good ones out there. But I think it's a unique film in that regard in terms of what it's exploring thematically.
Yeah, I think also what's interesting about the way this movie uses war is that it also becomes this larger metaphor for a descent into barbarism almost, or this movement from, or at least a perceived movement from like a state of civilization into one that's less so. And that's also, you know, made obvious by going from a state of peace to a state of war, but also it's also kind of hinted at in the way the hotel world works in this sense, and the whole kind of vocation of this concierge and the lobby boy, and which I think has some very interesting themes about the nobility in servitude and the kind of decline or erosion of that in a time that moved further and further towards individualism, where it's not so much about how you can serve someone else, but it's more about how, you know, the story of you as a person. Because that's one thing that fascinated me a lot about when I was watching it this time, about the way the whole job is portrayed that the concierge or that Gustav has and that he teaches to the lobby boy, whereas it kind of sounds sort of depressing at first sight, where you can, especially where you see the routine where the lobby boy wakes up at 5 a.m., then works till like 12 a.m. or to midnight. And he has these little meals throughout the day, and Gustav too, the little bit of time that he has for himself, he sits alone in his room eating this cup of oatmeal or whatever. And there's really like no place for personal living in that workspace.
Right.
And nowadays we would look at that as a kind of as a sort of state of failure almost, that you have no time for yourself, you have no name that you build up, you know, no career that you build up, there's no story about you. But at the same time, there's something that feels, as I said, like there's a certain kind of nobility in the way the movie depicts this complete sacrifice of self to dedicate your entire being to serving others and making sure other people have a great time or a pleasant time or whatever, or get their needs met. Which I think, especially in today's culture, is very interesting to consider how that transition may have happened from a time where there was more space for such thinking or such a cultural mind, and a collective as well as an individual mindset, like towards one where the idea of that kind of self-sacrifice to serve others has become kind of undesired maybe, or almost in some ways even unthinkable. Like it's, I'm not sure what the best way to describe it is, but especially if you like think about what it means to have a career in this day and age. Like it means having a story about you. You know, you are someone who came from somewhere and you have all these special experiences that made you unique. You know, you traveled to Asia or whatever, or you did some volunteer work there. And then you stay, you know, if you get a job, then you stay there until it's served your needs, and then it's time for like the next challenge of your career. And then, you know, a career becomes like this highly individualized and personal thing, instead of just like, I'm going to get a job and I'm going to dedicate like I'm going to stay there for the next 40 years of my life and that's it.
Well, what we have now is people who like their career becomes themselves. Like the stuff we do is, even to some extent, you at least have like a name for your channel. Mine's just Thomas Flight. And so it's like, what is my business? It's Thomas Flight is my career. But that's like what the influencer, online content creator, personal brand, a lot of like actors and directors. Wes Anderson himself is kind of this. It's like, what does Wes Anderson do? Well, he bees Wes Anderson. He is Wes Anderson. That's his whole thing. But we see a exact like reversal of that in this movie, where there's moments where Gustav H, there's that moment where they meet after the jailbreak. He meets back up with Zero. He sort of says offensive things about Zero's, where he came from and all of this stuff. And Zero says like he had to leave because of this war. And then Gustav is like immediately struck by that and he apologizes, but he's like, the Grand Budapest Hotel apologizes. Like, for Gustav H, it's he's not his career. He is the hotel, and the hotel is his career. There's this like identification with the institution, with the larger like body of the thing, and like it's the opposite of the thing being yourself. So yeah, I think you're totally right that there's something there depicted there that is not common these days.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess you still see it in like the service industry, but it's where I think it's rightfully depicted as or talked about as mostly in the negative, in the sense that there's workers being exploited for the sake of someone else, which I'm not sure is the kind of service that the Grand Budapest Hotel depicts. That kind of, even though it doesn't depict the lobby boy or the kind of work that goes into the hotel as glamorous, it does show it as we said before, like as hard work where there's barely any room for anything personal. But at the same time, there is, I don't know, there is some, like I've very briefly worked in a service position where it was like the most like low effort, low responsibility job that I ever had. Like but even there, like I did feel like, especially in the moments where I wasn't feeling like the pressure from like a manager who's like constantly on your case trying to get like more productivity out of you, but when you're actually like engaging with the customers, there were moments where that's genuinely like it does feel liberating in a sense that you can just help someone else and then see their like contentment or their happiness, or as fleeting as it is and as insignificant as it is. It does feel like I can imagine there's a liberating quality to that, to just not have to worry about anything about yourself and just have your whole purpose be directed to someone else. But it has to come from like a sort of voluntary position. Obviously, like there's it's not a way to like condone slavery or exploitation or anything where the sort of purpose or taking away the self becomes the purpose in its own right. But when it's done like voluntary and when it's done with like proper compensation, and then I think it can be a quality that we nowadays tend to dismiss too often, where we try to consider more like, what does this mean for me? Like, how can I make this about me, instead of asking like, maybe it's might be more freeing to kind of think about how you can serve someone else, or yeah. I'm not sure if that made sense, but
no, I think it does. I think an important part of that dynamic is like a sense of ownership, maybe not literal ownership, although we see that in this movie. Like eventually the hotel becomes a thing that Gustav and then Zero themselves own. But in that identification, when you have like a sense of stake or control in how you go about doing things, or a sense of ownership in how you conduct yourself within a certain space, I think that identification can be healthy because it's still yours in a sense. I think a big part of why we see, especially in places like America, we see a trend very much away from this in like the service industry towards that atomized individualization, is because like a service worker now, most places, is so alienated from a sense of ownership. It's like, if you're in service at a hotel, it's like you're working for that hotel, and then that hotel is owned by this massive chain, and there's you probably have like a guidebook this thick of like not like cool like rules about how you do things like you see in this movie, but like corporate policies about what you can and can't do. And it's like you have no sense of, you can't develop that sense of identity in this thing that is yours that you get to participate in, because there's no sense of ownership. You're just like this tiny little ant in the whatever.
I think also one element there might be that what you see in the Grand Budapest is that there's this sacrifice of self, but it's at the same time it's this sort of, you give yourself to the larger soul of the business, so to say, or the larger ideal that the hotel in this case represents. And so there's a sacrifice of the self, but at the same time there's this kind of encapsulation of the self into this greater ideal, or that you find meaning in then as a someone who participates in the expression of that greater ideal. And that's why in the movie it also, the job is not so much about protocol as it is about like decorum and virtues. And like, even there was this little bit where you see that Gustav gives these speeches and he like teaches them philosophy a little bit.
Yeah.
And I feel like that in the real world equivalent nowadays, that's the thing that might be missing. Like it feels like the self is being neglected, but at the same time there's no greater identity that you then get to partake in. It's just you're being robbed of yourself without getting anything in return. And I feel like that might also be like more spiritually speaking the difference between the two, where it's you just become emptied out without being given anything in return. And that's one of the things that makes the work that we see in Grand Budapest Hotel so qualitatively different from what we tend to see in like the corporate world of today, unfortunately. One last thing, it makes sense that in response to that, or in reaction to that, when people no longer find like this greater identity in the work itself, that it becomes more a burden on their own. Like they have to now write their own story, basically. Like they become their own biography that they have to write, and instead of being able to kind of link themselves to this external larger identity that they then can just connect themselves to and find meaning in, and have that be sufficient.
If anybody's listening to this wondering, like neither of us are saying the depiction of the job that Gustav H has is like realistic, or like something that should actually, is this like ideal that we could aspire to. But I think it's a caricature of a certain kind of, like, it's a symbolic caricature of a certain kind of engagement with like work or identity or an institution. I think that's the other thing that Zero says at one point. He's like, he calls the Grand Budapest Hotel an institution. And so there's a lot of, this movie is about something that I think a lot of people have talked about, which is kind of this decay of institutions that has happened in the last, whether it's like people had these identities to these different institutional structures, whether they were, a business, a religion, a hotel, a church, a government body. You might like identify with this thing that has this broader purpose, and then like part of your identity is an engagement with that in a very like sincere way. But that's something we've seen very much begin to like go away, I think, to some extent, where people are much more skeptical of institutions, sometimes for very good reasons. But regardless of whatever their pros and cons were, there's something that are much less sort of like have much less like draw in terms of being something that people latch their identity onto. We see other examples of that, of what you're talking about in the movie. So Agatha, yeah. She also has this like, she works for Mendel, and Mendel's name is on the box, but like she has this dedication to her work, and it's part of her, like kind of her character and who she is. And we also have Kovacs, who's this lawyer, and he's like, I work for the estate. There's a moment where the kind of the baddies come in I'm forgetting everybody's name. The Adrian Brody character.
Oh yeah.
He comes in and he's like, who are you working for? And Kovacs is kind of like, well, technically I work for like the estate. He's like, I'm essentially saying like, I work for this institution, this this ideal concept. There's rules. I'm a lawyer. I can't just do what you want me to do. And he gets killed because of that by the bad guys. So I think that like throughout the movie there, you know, it's not just with Gustav in the hotel, but there's this like broader sense of this sort of like traditional identification with your work, and that is being sort of like undercut throughout the film.
Yeah. I think it also there's a certain. There's one thing I want to talk about. I'm not sure if I'm trying to find the best bridge towards.
Well, maybe we can just hard go into it, and then we'll find our way back out.
The sort of the more personal philosophy of justice, I guess, that Gustav has, which I think is also very interesting. I wonder if to what extent it fits into that larger concept that we were talking about just now.
Right.
Where once you are invited into, like, once you've given yourself over to this collective identity or institution, that the institution is also becomes protective of you, like it should be protective of you. Because there's this, one of my favorite moments of the movie is quite early on, actually, is where Gustav has just started working with Zero, and they're in the train. I'm not sure what, I think they go to the funeral. Anyways, they're traveling by train, and that's when they get stopped by the Nazis or the not Nazis. But and there's this there's some argument about Zero's traveling papers, and that he's actually not, he doesn't have the right visa or something like that. But then Gustav, he like responds very intensely. He goes like, "Keep your hands off my lobby boy."
Right.
And you see the movie takes like this beat to show Zero's reaction, which it's just one of my favorite moments of or might just be my favorite moment in the whole movie, where he kind of recognizes or like sees how genuinely Gustav cares about him, even though he's just like his lobby boy, he's just a servant, but still he's like willing to like stand for his principles to protect him, and to kind of, even at his own risk, like to put his foot down to make sure he's protected. And I don't know, there's just something very beautiful about that, in the way that he doesn't just take him under his wing as a sort of little lobby boy that he wants to get into shape for the work that has to be done, but that he's also like taking care of him, or that he assumes like the full responsibility of what it means to take care of someone and to really protect someone and to take someone in. That it also means that when it's like when there's trouble or when there's hardship, that you also stick to those same principles and just take care of each other. And that's I don't know, I just love that little moment, and I'm not sure if there's a wider thesis there, but I just wanted to mention it.
I mean, I think it's the side of Gustav that makes us like probably the most sympathetic to him, is sort of the way he kind of takes Zero under his wing, and because he's kind of this like flawed, he's this flawed sort of character. He has these ideals, but it's this very romanticized vision of like high class society and how it should conduct itself. And there's like a lot of elements of that are, I think, admirable in how he conducts himself, where there's sort of a respect and like a respectfulness towards just people in general, even those who, he's maybe in conflict with. He has this sense of like, I'm going to treat you more or less as a human. We see this, that's shown again in the prison, where like he gives this one guy a bowl of mush and like recommends it and gives it some salt, and then that guy like has his back later on. So it's like there's kind of this like, oh, we're treating each other as humans and we're treating each other decently. And I think that is something that's very endearing. And then also, yeah, the way he's like just kind of taking Zero under his wing and treating him well and being protective of him, and not just treating him like, oh, you're a lobby boy, so you don't mean anything to me. It's almost more like, you're the lobby boy, you're the most important, like, part of this institution. And then we do find out later on that part of why he's like that is because he started out as a lobby boy, so he also has this sense of, that was his path to where he is now. But also, the character is like, he's trying to hold on to this thing that's slipping out of his fingers, and those, I think the movie's relationship to that Gustav and his sort of ideals is interesting, because they ultimately don't save him. Like, they don't really, I guess, I don't know. It's interesting. I guess that's where the melancholy comes from to some extent, where it's like, in some sense, the way he's behaving is like the reason he inherits the Grand Budapest Hotel and the reason he passes it on to Zero. Yeah. But like, at the same time, probably my favorite line in the movie is just in the end they shot him. The way that his story concludes off camera, inconsequentially. It's like, and I think that's where this connects to the like wartime themes of the film. It's just the way that like this one person's story, this one person's way that they are trying to conduct their lives, just ends up getting bulldozed by the war, the broader movements of society. It's like that those ways of behaving had a lot of like personal impact on Zero and on the people around him, but they had basically no long-term like cultural impact, or they just get completely destroyed by culture. At least it feels like within the movie.
I think that also rings back to that quote that we mentioned earlier about that Gustav's world that already vanished long before he even entered it.
Yeah.
So in that sense, he might be also representative of this sort of idealized version of humanity. Like, what if we all acted with decorum and respect and
appreciated
civility?
Poetry.
Yeah. Then, we wouldn't fall into the kind of barbaric destruction that we see happen in this movie, or in the distrust that because there's this little conflict between the way he because it's established at the beginning that he tends to sleep with a lot of the older women at his hotel, and to him it's like he sees it as a sort of appreciation of them, I guess. Like, it seems to come from a place of love, but then later when we hear it from Dimitri's perspective, I think it was, he kind of points out like he's been bothering us for like 20 years and he's just conning these old women into maybe getting like a piece of the inheritance when they eventually pass on. But I'm not sure like if that's supposed to make us genuinely question the nature of his character, or that it's more a sign of that the way his genuinely good intentions are misinterpreted by the outside world, which then again leads to that sort of decline and fall of civilization that happens later on. But I don't know. There's something there about the way, about what Gustav represents and what the world really is, and to what extent what that says about Gustav. Is he sort of a kind of dreamlike ideal that humanity can never reach, or is it never something? Is it something that's not us to begin with? Is it not something we would even strive towards, or if it was something that we genuinely once were in some regards, at least, that we have lost as we moved forwards. But I guess it leaves it's kind of left open to interpretation.
There's a lot of like loneliness in the character too, and I think like longing for like a real acceptance and identification. So I think, you know, that's to some extent a little bit of like not like a counter argument, but I think it balances out the idealism that it's presenting of this position. Is like, you know, there's a little tiny moment where in the prison he's been sharing the Mendels with this one crew, and they like start talking to him, and they go, "You're one of us," and he kind of is like suddenly fawns. He's like, "Oh, you know, that's such a wonderful thing to say," and it's like, I love the idea that that's not just him being polite, that like he as a character, and this is what I feel in the performance, and this is where I think like Ray Fiennes is really elevating this character probably beyond what's even on the page a little bit, is like I feel like in that moment he's not just being polite, he is like getting finally a little bit of what he has always desired, which is like to feel like he belongs as a part of this like accepted in group. And he does eventually kind of get that towards the end when he inherits the hotel, and then Zero talks a little bit about how, you know, he was finally a part of this kind of world that he had always like looked at from the outside. So I think there's this longing for this identification with something, that maybe comes from this sense of, you know, displacement or being on the outside. So yeah, I think it's kind of, I think one of the reasons this movie, that's one of the things I appreciate about this movie, is everything we're talking about is there completely underneath this like mostly comedic layer of whimsy, but it's there when you look. And also it's not just like trying to squeeze in these like simple thematic explorations of like small concepts that, you know, are easily resolved. There's a complexity there, and it doesn't have an easy answer for us by the end of like, you know, oh, this is the moral of the story, we should all be more like Gustav H because, you know, it's great. I think there's a sense of this is someone's story, and if we get anything out of it, we get a sense of like the personal impact. Like the other part I love is at the end when the writer is asking why Mustafa kept the hotel, and he says he didn't do it for Gustav, he did it for Agatha. There's such a poignancy at the end to like everything that mattered in this story ultimately was the personal connection between Zero and Mustafa, and the like the thing that is so important here was the thing that like Mustafa was almost too emotionally gripped by to even talk about. Like he keeps not bringing up Agatha in the story because he doesn't want to talk about her, because it's too like it's too emotionally heavy for him. But he eventually does a little bit, and it's like that was ultimately the most important thing. Is like I don't know. I like where it goes with that as well, where, you know, there's all the hotel ultimately what is like, it is an institution and it provided these things, but that ultimately wasn't what was important. Like the only reason the hotel is important at the end is because that was where Zero and Agatha had some happy times together. It's like, because that's what mattered, was that like personal connection. So I don't know if the movie resolves anything. I think that's kind of where it directs us at the end.
Yeah, I think I agree mostly with that. It's because I was thinking, I haven't really talked about the love story yet, but I think it's true what you say, that it's deliberately pushed to the sidelines because it's almost like Mustafa's almost deliberately like distracting us with Gustav's story in order to not have to talk about Agatha, which is ultimately, as you said, like the thing that he cared about most and the thing that moved him most deeply, the most painful and also the most beautiful memories of his life. But yeah, I guess it does sort of complete that transition from, if the institutions are falling apart, if we can no longer find like Gustav, like a full identity in like this larger cohesive identity, then and maybe if you kind of take Gustav's hidden loneliness into account, maybe it was never there to begin with, arguably, then at least maybe you can find it in a romantic relation, or just the relation that you have with those around you, those who are close to you. And I think that, as you said it best already, that is in the end what the hotel really meant to Mustafa. Thank you all for listening. If you enjoy the show and want to help us keep it going, be sure to follow us on our creator-owned streaming service, Nebula. On Nebula, you can experience our podcast ad-free, listen to all of our episodes a week early, and get instant access to all of our monthly bonus episodes. Last time we talked about the amazing Netflix show Beef, but before that we've also covered Fight Club, Babylon, Avatar: The Way of Water, the new All Quiet on the Western Front, Drive, and many, many more. So you're really getting a whole new catalog of episodes. You can sign up directly at our Nebula page, that's nebula.tv/cinema of meaning, or just follow the link in the description. Alternatively, you can support us on Patreon, where you'll find the Cinema of Meaning Discord community in which you can discuss movies with us and with fellow listeners, and the catalog of bonus episodes is also available there. The link for that is also in the description. Thank you for listening to Cinema of Meaning. I'll see you again next time.